in the heart of Africa, where the horizons stretch to the endless savannas, hides a small village called Umbara. Here life flows slowly, obeying the rhythms of nature and age-old traditions. The people of Umbara knew each other by sight, and each day was like the last, until one day a stranger appeared on the road leading to the village. Amani was young, her eyes shining with an energy and curiosity rarely found in this wilderness. She lived with her family, helping her mother with chores and caring for her younger siblings. Amani had a dream to see the world beyond the village, but she knew that in reality her life would most likely be spent here in Umbara. One day, as the sun was slipping towards sunset and the long shadows of the trees fell across the narrow, dusty road, Amani spotted a dusty caravan slowly approaching the village. It was an infrequent visitor, a merchant named Luca who travelled to Umbara to barter goods with the locals. Luca was a middle-aged man with a keen eye and a weathered face that reflected the many kilometers he had travelled. His sturdy figure and confident gait immediately caught Amani's attention. She was standing by the roadside, watching the caravan approach, when their gazes met. Luca lingered for a moment, surprised by her beauty and the directness of her gaze, but immediately continued on his way without seeming to care. The next day, Luca unveiled his wares in the square, and people began to flock to him to see what he had brought. Among them was Amani, who was drawn to anything new and unusual. She came closer, interested in the brightly colored fabrics, bone and wood jewelry that was so rare in their land.
Hello, beautiful girl,
Luca said, noticing her interest. His voice was deep and calm, like the dark waters of a river at night.
Are you looking for something?
Amani looked at him and smiled, feeling her cheeks flush from his attention.
I'm just looking,
she replied.
We don't often get new things in our village.
Mess. Then you're lucky I'm here.
Luca winked slyly.
I have a lot of amazing things that might interest you.
Amani couldn't help laughing. She was easily charmed by Luca. His confidence, his wit, and the ease with which he interacted with people. She spent most of the day at his counter, either helping her mother with her shopping or just talking to Luca, discussing goods and telling him about her life in the village.
Mo, have you always been a merchant?
She asked as the sun began to set and the village slowly faded into twilight.
Yes, ever since I can remember,
Luca answered, laying out his things.
But when I was a boy, I dreamed of being a sailor. I wanted to sail the oceans, to see distant countries, but life took a different course.
I dream of seeing the world too,
Amani confessed.
But I'm afraid I belong here in Umbara.
Luca looked at her carefully, as if assessing the depth of her words. He sensed that this girl was different from the others. There was a lust for life in her eyes that was rare among village girls. He wanted to know her better, to understand what was behind that thirst.
The world is much bigger than you can imagine,
Luca said quietly.
But sometimes what we are looking for is closer than we think.
Amani thought about his words, but didn't ask what he meant. Instead, they continued talking until the sky was covered in stars, and Luca had packed up to spend the night at the elder's house, where the next few days passed quickly. Luca stayed in the village, trading and growing closer to Amani. They often walked together, talking about life, about the world outside the village, and Amani became more and more fascinated by this interesting man. She had never met anyone like him. Luca was full of stories, wisdom, and confidence that mesmerized her. She felt special in his presence, as if their fates were intertwined. One evening, when the sun was almost hidden behind the horizon, Luca and Amani found themselves on the outskirts of the village, where the savannah transitioned seamlessly into a dense jungle. They were sitting on an old fallen tree, watching the last rays of the sun, which colored the sky in bright red and gold tones.
Amani?
Luca spoke softly, and she turned to him. His eyes were full of thoughtfulness, and his voice was softer than usual.
I must leave. A merchant can't stay in one place for long.
Luca's words sounded like thunder. Amani felt her heart clench painfully. She didn't want him to leave, but she realized that this was his life.
Mo, but I don't want you to leave.
She confessed, barely holding back tears.
You have become dear to me.
Luca took her hand and squeezed it in his palms.
I don't want to leave either,
He said, looking into her eyes.
but if I stay, we'll be forced to face reality. Can I give you what you deserve? The life of a merchant is full of danger.
Amani understood his fears, but her feelings were stronger.
I'm not afraid of the future.
She said firmly.
If you're with me, I'm ready to go through anything.
Luca was surprised at her determination. He could see that this girl was willing to follow him despite the risks. Her love and trust were important to him, but the weight of responsibility for her future also weighed on his heart.
All right,
He said after a long silence.
give me some time to think about it. I'll go away for a few weeks, settle my affairs, and come back to you. We'll make a decision together.
Amani nodded, realizing that the best thing she could do now was to let him go, trusting his words. She knew Luca was being honest with her, and she trusted that he would come back. The next day, Luca packed his things and set out on his journey. Amani walked him to the outskirts of the village, where they said goodbye. There was sadness in his eyes, but he promised to return. Amani stood on the road until his figure disappeared over the horizon, and then slowly made her way back home, hoping her feelings would not be in vain. Days passed, weeks passed, but Luca did not return. Every day, Amani went out on the road and waited, but all she saw were endless dusty roads leading nowhere. But there was hope in her heart that he would come back and they could build their happiness together. The story of their love began beautifully, but fate was preparing for them trials that neither Amani nor Luca knew were coming. It had been months since Luca had left Umbara village, promising to return to Amani. Time passed slowly, and with each passing day, the girl grew more and more worried about whether Luca would keep his word. She continued with her daily chores, helping her mother and caring for her younger siblings, but thoughts of Luca never left her. The hope of his return was the only thing that gave her strength. One day, when Amani was feeling particularly weak and tired, she felt nauseous, and this went on for days on end. At first, she wrote off her condition as heat and tension, but when the symptoms didn't go away, her mother, who had been closely monitoring her daughter's condition, noticed the changes and suspected that something unusual was going on.
Mani, you should see a witch doctor.
Her mother said, one morning when Amani felt dizzy once again.
Moo, this doesn't sound like a normal ailment.
Amani agreed, though her anxiety was growing. She knew that the village witch doctor, an old and wise man named Bakari, could answer her questions. The next day she went to see him.
Bakari's house was on the outskirts of the village, among tall trees that seemed to shield him from prying eyes. Amani entered the dark hut, where the old man sat surrounded by herbs, potions, and amulets. Bakari looked up when he saw the girl and smiled as if anticipating her visit.
Amani, my child, what brings you to me?
He asked, inviting her to sit down.
I'm not well.
Amani replied quietly.
I have nausea and weakness, and it won't go away. I don't know what's wrong with me.
Bakari listened to her carefully and then asked her to hold out her hand. He put his fingers on her wrist, listening to her pulse, then touched her stomach as if trying to feel something important. Amani looked at him anxiously, waiting for the verdict.
Amani, you are pregnant?
Bakari finally said, pulling away from her hand and looking into her eyes.
Life is being born in your womb.
The old man's words sounded like thunder. Amani felt the whole world spinning around her. She knew her relationship with Luca was close, but she hadn't expected it to lead to pregnancy.
Never pregnant.
She repeated, not believing her ears.
But how was that possible? Luca left a few months ago.
It's true, my child.
Bakari replied with a softness in his voice.
But life doesn't always follow our expectations. Sometimes it brings us surprises.
Amani was silent, trying to comprehend what she had heard. Her heart was filled with conflicting emotions, the joy of carrying Luca's child and the fear of the unknown. A new challenge awaited her that she had never even considered before. Returning home, Amani pondered how her life would change. She knew that in the village, her situation would not be easily accepted. But despite this, there was hope in her heart. Luca's child was her connection to the man she loved. She believed he would come back and they could start a family.
The weeks and months continued to go by. Amani's belly began to grow, and it soon became obvious that she was pregnant. At first, the villagers were curious and sympathetic, but as time went on and labour did not come, their attitudes
9 months passed, then 10, and each day people turned their attention to her more and more anxiously and distrustfully. They whispered behind her back, discussing the unusual length of her pregnancy. Some said it was a curse. Others thought Amani was hiding something important, and some even began to avoid her, fearing the unknown. Amani could feel the tension building around her, but it was her own condition that bothered her the most. She couldn't understand why her pregnancy was taking so long. Time passed. Her belly continued to grow. She turned to Bakari again, but the old man only shrugged his shoulders, saying he had never encountered anything like this before.
Amani,
He said, one day when she came to him again.
I don't know why this is happening, but I feel that the child you are carrying is unusual. Perhaps his destiny is special, and that is why nature behaves differently.
Amani listened to his words, but it did not bring her relief. She began to question whether she was prepared for what lay ahead. One evening, as the sky turned dark purple, Amani was sitting on the doorstep of her house, deep in thought, when her friend Nia, one of the few people who had not turned away from her in her time of need, approached her.
Amani, how are you feeling?
Nia asked, sitting down beside her.
It is getting harder every day.
Amani admitted with her head down.
I don't understand what is happening to me. People in the village think I am cursed, and I am beginning to believe it.
Nia put her arm around her friend's shoulders, trying to comfort her.
Don't say that, Amani.
She said softly.
You are strong, and I believe that everything will work out. You are carrying a new life under your heart. Who knows?
Amani sighed, glancing up at the starry sky.
But why is it so complicated?
She whispered.
I just wanted love and a family, and now I don't know if I can bear the ordeal. Luca never came back, and I'm alone with this baby that doesn't want to be born.
Nia thought for a moment, then decided to share her thoughts.
I think everything in this life happens for a reason,
She said.
Maybe this baby is really special and you need to be patient. I don't know why it happened, but I believe you will get through it. And remember, I will always be there for you no matter what happens.
Amani thanked Naya for her support, but there was still anxiety in her heart. Every day she woke up with the hope that maybe today would be the moment when she could hold her baby, but day by day that hope faded.
A year passed, then another. Amani's pregnancy continued. Her belly grew to a huge size, and walking became incredibly difficult for her. The villagers no longer just avoided her. Many openly expressed their displeasure and fear. Some believed that Amani had brought misfortune to their village and insisted that she leave Umbara. But Nia and a few other women stood up for her, not allowing the village elders to banish her. Amani could feel her strength waning. She was exhausted by the constant waiting and fear for her child's future. One night, as the rain drummed on the roof of her hut, she turned to Bakari again.
Makari, I can't wait any longer.
She said with tears in her eyes.
Not you, if what am I to do? I cannot stay like this forever.
The old man listened to her carefully, then put his hand on her shoulder.
Amani, you have gone through many trials,
He said quietly.
but I feel that the end is near. Your patience will be rewarded. Your child will soon be born, and he will bring with him changes that will affect not only you, but the entire village.
What if he is never born?
Amani asked in a trembling voice.
My child, faith is all we have.
Bakari replied.
You need to believe that this child will choose the right moment to be born.
The right moment to be born. Believe in his strength and in your own.
Amani realized that all she had to do was wait. She returned home, mentally repeating Bakarai's words. Her heart was full of doubt and fear, but deep inside there was hope that the old man was right and that the trials she was going through were not in vain.
The 3rd year of her pregnancy had passed. Amani could hardly move. Her body was exhausted, but suddenly, one quiet night, she felt a strong movement inside her. It was like a sudden jolt, as if her baby had finally decided it was time to come into the world. Amani went into labor, which lasted a long time, exhausting her last strength. But she knew this was the moment Bakari had spoken of. With each contraction, she thought of her baby, imagining finally seeing his face. The women of the village gathered around her, Nia among them, to help her through these difficult hours.
When the baby was finally born, the whole village fell silent. Amani, exhausted and tired, cradled her baby to her chest, feeling tears of joy flow down her cheeks. She looked at the baby and her heart was filled with unspeakable love and relief.
The women around her began to whisper, discussing the unusual birth. But Amani did not hear them. She was immersed in her happiness. Her long agony and fears were finally over. The child she had carried for 3 years was finally with her, and she knew that a new life full of challenges lay ahead of them. But now she was ready for them. This long and agonizing pregnancy changed not only Amani's life, but the entire village. The people soon realized that the birth of this child brought with it more than just a new beginning. They began to believe that baby Amani was connected to forces they didn't understand but respected. And this was the beginning of a new era in the life of Umbara. Time passed, and Amani found herself increasingly in need of support. It had been months since she had found out she was pregnant, but Luca had never returned. In the back of her mind, she continued to hope that he would keep his word, but with each passing day, her confidence faded. Amani often walked out to the road, leading out of the village, and gazed into the distance, longing to see a familiar figure, but the path remained empty. Her belly continued to grow, but labor did not come. This strange and agonizing weight was weighing on her more and more every day, causing anxiety and fear. Finally, when Amani was about to give up hope, Luca returned to the village. His unexpected appearance brought her a brief moment of joy and relief. However, when he learned of her unusually long pregnancy, his reaction was not at all what she had hoped for. Luca, who had previously seemed reliable and loving to her, had suddenly changed. He was puzzled and anxious, and Amani immediately noticed the uncertainty and fear in his eyes. Luca began to avoid talking about the future, averting his eyes when Amani tried to talk about the baby. There was an anxiety in his demeanor that only grew stronger with each passing day. Gradually, doubts began to creep into his soul. Everything he saw and heard seemed strange and frightening to him. The stories of the locals about curses on spirits that could interfere in people's lives disturbed him. He began to think that such a long pregnancy could not be a common occurrence, that it was a sign of something sinister. These thoughts began to overwhelm him, and unable to cope with his growing fear, Luca became increasingly withdrawn. He began to consider various scenarios in which being around Amani could get him into trouble. For a merchant used to relying on his own strength and skills, this situation seemed increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. Thoughts that his involvement in this situation could bring misfortune upon him and his business grew within him. Despite the deep feelings he once had for Amani, Luca could not ignore his fears. A shadow of doubt and dread of the unknown flickered in his eyes as he looked at her growing belly. He began to avoid her, finding excuses not to stay near her. Amani noticed these changes and her heart clenched with pain, but she tried not to show her fears. She hoped that Luca would still come to his senses and become the man she knew and loved again. One day, however, while the village was still asleep, Luca made a final decision. He packed his things and, without saying goodbye to Amani, he left the village. His departure was sudden, but in his heart he knew he could not have done otherwise. His fear of what he thought was a curse was too great. He left Amani alone in her suffering and doubt, deciding that his salvation was more important than his duty to the woman he had once promised to love and support. For Luca, this decision was both a relief and agony. He knew he had betrayed Amani, but at the same time he felt he had saved himself from what seemed to him to be inevitable disaster. As he left the village, Luca tried not to think about what he had left behind. He continued on his way, trying to forget what had happened in Umbara and the woman who was now just a memory to him. Amani, on learning of his disappearance, sank into deep sadness. Her heart was broken and her soul was gripped by loneliness. Luca's betrayal was a terrible blow to her, which further aggravated her already difficult situation. She was left alone, with a growing belly and the incessant expectation of childbirth, which never. The villagers began to take notice of her condition, but instead of sympathy, she felt judgment and fear. Amani had become an outcast in her own home and had to accept that she could no longer count on the support or understanding of others. Her love for Luca, which had been a source of hope and joy for her, turned into pain and bitter. But despite all the suffering and betrayal, Amani could not allow herself to break. She knew that her strength now had to come from within, and only she alone could give her child what he needed. Love and care no matter what. Luca could leave her, but she would not leave her child, who had become her only meaning in this hard and unfair life. After Luca's disappearance, Amani's life changed forever. She felt betrayal and loss in her heart and despair in her soul. At first she thought that the pain of losing her love was the worst thing that could happen to her. However, she soon realized that her loneliness and isolation in the village was even more agonizing. In Umbar, a small village where everyone knew each other since childhood, the changes in Amani's life did not go unnoticed. The girl's belly, which continued to grow but never gave signs of impending labor, rumors about her strange pregnancy spread with incredible speed. Whereas her fellow villagers had previously treated her with curiosity and cautious sympathy, now their views changed. They began to avoid her, as if fearing that her condition might harm them. As she walked along the village paths, Amani could feel the judgmental and suspicious stares bearing down on her. People whispered behind her back, and her hearing often picked up scraps of conversation that included the words curse and spirits. These conversations increased her sense of alienation and loneliness. It seemed that no one wanted to understand her suffering, and everyone only sought to distance themselves from her, as if she were the bearer of misfortune. With each passing day, Amani's isolation became more and more palpable. The women of the village used to visit her often to talk to her or help her with chores, but now her house was empty and silent. The women of the village stopped coming to visit, and even the children who used to play near her house now avoided it, as if fearing an invisible threat. Rumors began to circulate in the village that her long-term pregnancy was the result of witchcraft or a curse cast by evil spirits. Condemnation and fear from others plunged Amani deeper and deeper and deeper into despair. She felt she was becoming an outcast in her home village. Even those who had once been close to her were now estranged. People she had known since childhood stopped greeting her on the street, turning their faces away and hiding their gazes. Amani began to feel like a stranger in a world that had once been home to her. One day, trying to cope with her emotions, Amani decided to go to the river where she used to walk with Luca. However, several women from the village came across her path. When they saw Amani, they instantly became silent and turned away, as if her presence was something unwelcome and frightening. This moment, like so many others, heightened her sense of isolation. She realized that she no longer belonged to this community, and the thought tore at her heart. Gradually, Amani's life became a constant avoidance of contact. She tried not to leave the house unnecessarily to avoid meeting people and feeling their hostility. The house, which used to be a place of comfort and security for her, she spent long hours alone, fighting the rolling waves of despair and fear for the future. Despite all this, Amani couldn't shake the guilt. She was tormented by the thought that perhaps her fellow villagers were right, and her unusual pregnancy was indeed a manifestation of something sinister. These thoughts did not let her rest, and every day she was sinking deeper into depression. Her life began to seem like a vicious circle of pain and despair from which there was no escape. Amani began to lose strength, not only physically but mentally as well. Her face became pale and haggard, and her eyes lost their former vivacity. She stopped taking care of herself. Her days passed in endless anticipation of something that might never come. The future seemed uncertain and frightening, and the feeling of isolation and loneliness became more and more unbearable. Rumors of her curse grew to the point where even the village elders began to debate whether Amani should be left among them. Some suggested banishing her so as not to endanger the village. Although it did not come to a final decision, the tension in the village was growing, and it was aggravating the girl's condition. Amani realized that she was in complete isolation, rejected by those she had known all her life. But despite all this, deep inside Amani, there was a faint hope. She still believed that someday this series of suffering would end, that the labor she had waited so long for would come after all, and her child would come into the world, illuminating her darkness with the light of new life. But every morning, waking up alone and silent, she realized that this day had not yet come, and she would have to continue fighting for her life and the life of her child. And so the long months passed, full of fear, pain, and isolation. Amani remained in the shadow of her unfulfilled dream of love and family, immersed in her own despair, while her body continued to carry a new life inside her, waiting to be born. Left all alone, rejected by village society, Amani realized she needed to find an answer to her agonizing questions. Why is her pregnancy taking so long? What is the force holding her baby inside her? These thoughts haunted her days and nights, and the more she tried to find answers within herself, the more she felt helpless. On one long day, when her despair had reached a breaking point, Amani made a decision that she decided to travel to a distant land, hoping to find help from wise elders or shamans who could shed light on her mysterious condition. Knowing the few belongings she might need along the way, Amani left her home, the same home that had once been her sanctuary, but was now a symbol of pain and isolation. She left the village that had become her source of suffering and began her long journey across the desolate and dangerous lands of Africa. The road proved difficult and exhausting. Amani walked across the vast expanse of savanna, where dry grass rustled beneath her feet and the scorching sun burned her skin mercilessly. Her legs tired quickly, her body suffering from hunger and thirst, but her inner drive to find answers gave her strength. She knew this was her only chance to save herself and her child, and so she could not afford to stop. Amani met various people along the way. Shepherds, nomads, traders, but none of them could give her answers. Some were afraid to even speak to her when they heard her story, while others were just throwing up their hands, not knowing how to help. But Amani did not despair. She believed that somewhere out there, far away, there was someone who could understand her situation and help her. As she walked across the vast plains and dried up riverbeds, she thought more and more about her fate. Would she be able to find someone who could explain her condition? Or was her quest doomed to failure? Each new day brought new challenges. Sometimes she stopped in small villages to gather her strength and asked the locals about sages and shamans. But the answers she received were disappointing. Many simply did not believe in such stories or considered them legends of the past. However, Amani kept walking despite the difficulties. She knew that the road was long and that her journey required patience and fortitude. Passing from one village to another, she gradually approached a place she had heard stories about from the elders of her people. It was the land of the ancient sages, hidden deep in the dense forests, where shamans dwelt with knowledge passed down through generations. Weeks, perhaps months passed. Amani had already lost track of time, feeling her body growing weaker and weaker with fatigue. But her determination never weakened. Finally, after much wandering, She reached the village she had long heard stories about. This place looked completely different from her home village. There was a special atmosphere here, filled with ancient wisdom and the forces of nature. The people living in this village were different. Their eyes radiated knowledge and serenity, and their faces were marked with traces of wisdom. Amani, weary and weakened by the long journey, approached the elders of the village. These men were respected sages, keepers of tradition and knowledge. In their presence, Amani felt small and insignificant, but also felt that she had finally found a place where she could be understood and helped. She told her story, full of pain, fear and loneliness, hoping that the elders could explain her unusual condition. Their faces remained calm and centered as she spoke, and when Amani finished her story, they remained silent for a long time, deep in thought. Her words were not easy for them, for they knew that such cases were rare and required special understanding. After a long silence, the elders explained that her condition was due to ancient forces of nature that not everyone could handle. They spoke of how her pregnancy could be caused by the intervention of ancestral spirits or even gods, and that perhaps her child must be born at a certain time to fulfill its destiny. Amani listened to them, not fully understanding all the words, but sensing truth and wisdom in them. Then the elders advised her to go to a shaman who lived in a deep forest near the village. This shaman was known for his ability to communicate with spirits and understand the mysteries of nature. He could help her make sense of her situation and perhaps point the way to a resolution of her long and painful pregnancy. With renewed strength and hope, Amani set out to see the shaman. Her journey was still a difficult one, but now there was hope in her heart that she would finally find answers to her questions. There were new challenges ahead, but Amani was ready to overcome them for the sake of her child. The road to him was difficult and dangerous. Nature seemed alive, surrounding Amani on all sides. Mighty trees with thick crowns, intertwined vines, and moss covering everything around made it seem as if the forest breathed. There was a peculiar, slightly heavy humidity in the air, filled with the odors of herbs and earth. But Amani walked forward, driven not only by the desire to find answers, but also by a strange inner feeling that this was where the clue awaited her. After much wandering over dusty roads and narrow paths, Amani finally reached the place the elders had told her about. Deep in the forest, hidden from view, was the home of a shaman, a sage who was credited with power and knowledge that had been passed down from generation to generation. People said that he could penetrate the most secret depths of the human soul and see what was hidden from others. Finally, among the trees, she saw a humble dwelling, a small hut hidden from view and surrounded by amulets and symbols carved into the trees and stones. This place looked as if time had stopped here. It radiated ancient power and wisdom. Barely containing a shiver, Amani stepped closer. The shaman, sitting on the threshold of his hut, noticed her approach. His eyes were closed, but Amani sensed that he was already aware of her arrival. The old man was tall and thin, with skin darkened by sun and time. His hair, long and grey, fell to his shoulders, and his face was covered with deep wrinkles, each one as if telling a different story. His presence inspired respect and awe. Amani froze in front of him, waiting for him to speak. Without opening his eyes, the shaman held out his hand, beckoning Amani to sit across from him. He began to speak, and his voice was quiet, yet full of strength and confidence. The shaman said that he had known of her coming long before she had decided to make the journey herself. He said the spirits had warned him of a girl who carried something unusual. Not just a child, but a gift meant for her people. Amani listened to him, barely breathing. The old man's words shook her to the core. He explained that her unusual pregnancy was not a curse, as the people in her village thought, but a special gift sent to her by the forces that govern life. This gift was connected to an important mission she must fulfill for her people. The shaman spoke of ancient prophecies passed down to him from his ancestors. These prophecies spoke of a woman who would one day bring into the world a child who would carry within her the power and wisdom to change the destiny of an entire people. Imani was that woman. Her long-awaited child was to come at a most difficult time, when the people of her village would face grave challenges. This child, born with special powers, was to be a symbol of rebirth and new hope. Listening to these words, Imani felt mixed feelings. On the one hand, she was shocked and frightened by the greatness of the mission her child was being entrusted with. On the other hand, she felt relieved and comforted to know that her ordeal was not random and had deep meaning. She realized that her long-awaited motherhood was not just a personal event, but part of a larger plan on which the fate of many people depended.
The shaman continued to speak, revealing to her the essence of her mission. He explained that her unusually long gestation period was due to the need to prepare the child to fulfill its destiny. During this time, he was accumulating the strength and wisdom he needed to fulfill his role. The shaman also told her that the birth of the child was to occur at a special moment when the stars would rise to a certain position in the sky, marking the beginning of a new era for her people.
Imani realized that her role was not just to bear and give birth to the child, but to protect it and keep it safe so that it could fulfill its destiny. She realized that her duty to her people was not limited to her personal suffering. Her mission was far more important than she could have imagined. A new sense of responsibility and power awakened within her. The shaman concluded his revelations by blessing Imani on her onward journey. He said that her return to the village would not be easy, but she must return to fulfill her destiny. A difficult ordeal awaited her, but now she knew that her child was not just the fruit of her love, but a gift that she must carry through to the end. Despite the difficulties, with these thoughts, Imani left the shaman's dwelling. Her heart was filled with a new feeling, a mixture of fear and determination. She knew what she had to do. Now she was no longer just a girl, abandoned by her lover and rejected by society. She was the bearer of a great gift, and her mission was to save her people, to fulfill her destiny. This path was full of dangers, but Imani was ready to go all the way. Finally, one clear and warm day, the long-awaited moment came. Imani felt that the time had come. She was ready for this event. The labor took place, and despite all the difficulties, Imani was able to give birth to a baby that turned out to be extraordinary. 3 long years have passed since Imani traveled far away in search of help and understanding. Those years were filled with suffering and trials. Despite betrayal and isolation, she survived, sustained only by her determination and faith in her child's destiny. Each day her waiting grew more agonizing, but she knew there must come a time when her patience and courage would be rewarded. Her newborn son was a breath of new hope and strength. His skin bore symbols and signs that were difficult to explain in simple words. These signs not only adorned his body, but also radiated light, as if confirming the child's special destiny. His eyes, shining with a deep and wise gaze, immediately attracted attention. They seemed to radiate ancient wisdom and knowledge that Imani could barely comprehend. The child possessed rare abilities that began to manifest from the very beginning. He could soothe those around him with his presence, his smile radiating incredible warmth and peace. These abilities were a confirmation of the shaman's words of the great mission the child was to fulfill. For Imani, this was not only the long-awaited moment of the end of her suffering, but also the beginning of a new chapter in her life and the lives of her people. Her son, with his special signs and abilities, became a symbol of the new hope and change that was to come to her world. With joy and respect, she accepted this gift, knowing that his future was the future she had helped create and would now protect with all her strength. After a long and arduous journey, Imani returned to her home village, carrying her extraordinary child in her arms. She endured many trials during the 3 years she had been away from home. But now, with a new family member, her journey was complete. The village met her with surprise and cautious interest. At first, fellow villagers continued to regard Imani with distrust, They remembered her as a woman who had been rejected and who had become a symbol of the foreign and sinister. However, when the child showed his unusual abilities, there was marks on his skin, and his ability to bring peace and tranquility became obvious to everyone. People began to notice that he was indeed special. Gradually, the villagers began to recognize and respect Amani. They saw in her child a sign of new hope and strength that could change their destiny. The shaman's words about the great mission conveyed through her child began to ring true. People began to show Amani and her son great respect, eager to be a part of this new era he represented. Luca, upon learning of the birth of the unusual child and returning to the village, was overwhelmed by his new circumstances. He tried to re-enter Amani's life, realizing that her child had become a symbol of special power and destiny. However, his attempts to regain the lost relationship were futile. Amani, having gone through so many trials, and now possessing new strength and confidence, realized that Luca no longer had a place in her life. His betrayal and departure had left a deep wound, and her future was now tied to her child and the new role she was to play in the lives of her people. Thus, with Amani's return and the recognition of her child, the old tensions in the village began to subside. Her son became a symbol of new hope, and her story, which began with betrayal and isolation, ended with recognition and respect. Amani was able to find her place in the village, not as an outcast, but as the mother of a great child who was destined to bring change.